All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Umbrella Academy. Now, here's one of the things that we're going to cover here, and it's not a great big huge thing, it's kind of a small momentary thing, but it is designed to illustrate how powerful rumor is, because as you guys know in the Netflix series, when you see rumor, it's always like, I heard a rumor, and then usually it involves a power that's really similar to the Purple Man, Zebediah Killgrave, in the sense that she can get people to do the things that she wants. In the comics, she's way more powerful than that, but you don't see it very often, and that is one of the things to sort of explain here, right, to preface here, is that Gerard Way does present the different members of the Umbrella Academy as being exceedingly powerful. If this comic took place in the Marvel Universe, you'd be looking at characters with universal levels of power. But the reality is that the way Gerard Way wrote it is that because it's more of a dark humor type story, their powers, despite the fact that they can do incredible things, are largely used on a smaller scale, and for the most part scaled down. And so the reason why I say this is that what this does is it initially opens up essentially with the statue of Abraham Lincoln just wreaking havoc on Washington, D.C. and basically attacking everything. Like literally Pogo just has like sticks of dynamite, because remember this happens quite some time ago, about 17 years ago, so they're still little kids. So Pogo hasn't necessarily died yet. You still do have Ben here, so again, Ben hasn't necessarily died yet. Again, he died sometime between 17 years ago and the current moment. But the thing behind this is that with the statue just kind of going nuts and just basically attacking everybody, that the Umbrella Academy is basically trying to corral everybody in, trying to stay organized and structured, because remember, they're not really given a whole lot of direction by Reginald Hargreaves, right? They're kind of taught to operate as a team to a degree, but it's not really the same kind of tutelage that you're used to seeing with like the X-Men. What you end up getting though is you have rumor that basically fixes everything, and that's when she literally tells the president, tells the statue, I heard a rumor that you were assassinated. And so what you end up having is her just manifesting a statue of what's basically John Wilkes Booth taking out President Lincoln. Literally just shouting sic temper tyrannis, right? It's just kind of nuts. I mean, it's essentially the same thing he yelled after the assassination of Lincoln, but still, it's one of those things where she kind of manifests something into existence, and then at that point, the statue just basically runs off. We don't really find out what happens to it, but it basically takes away. But that's the thing about Rumor, right? She's incredibly powerful. 9 times out of 10, her power is used in a more confined space, which is getting people to do things. But she does have the ability to alter reality with her powers. I mean, imagine that, right? You got a character in Marvel Comics. I heard a rumor that I have the Infinity Stones. Suddenly the Infinity Gauntlet's in her hand. That's the kind of thing that you're talking about here. So it is a pretty high level of power, but you don't really see it used that often. Now, at that point, we kind of jump through, and we're gonna fast track this, but you kind of jump through what the different characters are doing in the aftermath of Volume 1 in the Apocalypse Suite. So the acceptance that Reginald Hargreaves is dead, the fact that they saved the world and everything that had gone on. For Luther himself, he's basically just morbidly obese, having fallen into a state of depression. He literally just sits around watching TV shows all day long and just eating cookies. That's basically it. The Seance is considered pretty famous now, right? Because he's the one that basically saved the world from like the meteor crashing into it. So he's done that much, which is pretty awesome, kind of enjoying his fame, not getting too carried away with it, but enough where it's kind of gone to his head and he sees himself as somewhat of a big deal. You do have Yanya, who of course now is referred to as the White Violin. That's kind of her thing, but she doesn't really remember anything that had happened and she can't move. You do have Rumor that holds a bit of a grudge against her, at least that seems to be the case. And in fact, in this instance, when you have Rumor approaching Yanya, you basically have Rumor who takes her away, literally whisks her off, even though White Violin doesn't remember who Rumor is. And then Rumor sits her in front of a whole bunch of monitors where she's forced to just watch everything that she had done when she had essentially turned into a villain. Rumor herself, of course, doesn't have the ability to use her voice, right? Of course, again, her throat was cut and in the last volume, so, you know, towards the end of that, she can't really talk as much. And then you have Diego, right? You basically have Kraken who's going through and trying to find out what's going on with the murders inside the diner. Because if you guys recall from Volume 1, while we didn't necessarily cover it in depth, it wasn't really relevant at that point in time. It is here. What had happened is there was a meeting, but there was a kind of conversation that took place between Pogo and Number 5 where they had gone to a diner. And that in the midst of that, you just kind of saw these guys come out of nowhere with no explanation as to who they were. And they just started attacking Number 5 and Pogo. And then they were swiftly dealt with off panel. So it was kind of like this just quick little 1 or 2 page thing that went on. I left it out because I felt like it would have been just a little too much information given everything that was going on in the first volume. But that was it, right? This is basically Kraken following up that lead. And his journey initially started in the last volume, but it's kind of continuing on here. That whole situation will be a huge point of conversation here in this story, hence the reason why we're focusing so much on it. But it's literally just Diego trying to find out what was going on in the diner and trying to understand everything that's taking place there. Now, again, what you end up doing, of course, is picking up with number 5, who's essentially betting the horses. That's kind of his thing. Of course, as he leaves the racetrack or gets out to the parking lot, suddenly you have him surrounded by all these different guys, right? All these different agents. They're kind of these wonky space age looking dudes. And of course, he overcomes every single one of them with what's basically the greatest of ease. And the question that has to be asked here is, how is he able to overcome every single one of these guys? And a lot of you guys are probably drawing on the TV show where you're like, well, I mean, he's a trained assassin. And he is. What happens here is a little bit different, slightly modified, although not deeply, not intensely, based on what you saw in the show. It's pretty similar in that way, but he overcomes every single one of these guys, right? Now, one of the things that I do want to point out here is that in the show, you got like Hazel and Cha-Cha. Here, it's a whole different beast. They exist, but they're totally different from the characters in the TV show. And I would say they're actually better in the comic than they are in the show. But in effect, he takes all these guys out, right? All these guys are defeated. And that's when you end up having one of them who's kind of a survivor and is like, okay, literally radios into headquarters and is like, we're all taken out, right? We're all basically dead. We need reinforcements. You need to send in Hazel and Cha-Cha. And as soon as number 5 hears that, he literally just experiences this massive amount of dread because he's like, we're already dead. Like, they're gonna kill us all. Like, Hazel and Cha-Cha are no laughing matter, right? They are not a joke at all. And so that's where you pick up with these two. Now, we're not really given any information about how they arrived here, although again, time travel shenanigans and whatnot, they just appear here, but they're basically at this diner, right? The same diner where you had everything that went down with number 5 and Pogo when they killed all those different agents. And Hazel and Cha-Cha, as they're depicted here, one thing that I want to point out, you never actually see their faces here. Instead, they just wear these giant cartoonish mask helmet things, and that's basically it. Now, we are going to be given some information about them, although we're not going to go into a deep dive about them because we don't get it, right? It's really one of those things where like we get a kind of description of them, and it's really more the context and the things they do that explain what they're about, more so than any backstory that we would get. But what goes on here is they talk about how delicious the pie is, and they're like, what's in this thing? And ultimately the chef comes out and he was like, we can't tell you. Like, I'm not going to tell you anything. And in fact, there was a guy that came here from Barcelona and offered me $5,000 for it. And I told him, man, you have to cut off my arms and legs in order to get that whole thing out of me. So again, at that point, that's basically what they do. Hazel and Cha-Cha cut off this guy's arms and legs in order to get the secret of what's in that pie. That's how twisted these guys are. I bet you didn't see that in the show. That's how messed up these dudes are. Now, while they're doing that, of course, they're basically contacted by headquarters, which is like, don't forget your mission. You're here to find the kid. And that's literally when they're like, oh yeah, I forgot. Okay, so did any of you guys remember like a little kid that was there? He basically acted like an adult. Do you have any memory of that or anything? Just while your arms and legs are gone. It's kind of crazy, but what the guy basically says is they use canned apples. It's like the only thing he says, right? Like, we use canned apples. And so it's kind of nuts. Of course, the waitress is just kind of made to watch the entire thing go down. But like, they literally cut this dude's arms and legs off with a saw. So that's why it's kind of wild, man. It's pretty extreme. That's why I say there's a very dark humor when it comes to Umbrella Academy. It's, in a lot of ways, very different from the Netflix show as you saw it. Now, one of the other things that goes on here is you basically pick up with Kraken in the office of Detective Lupo. Remember, Lupo being the guy who's basically watching everything and kind of going through this investigation with number 5. For the most part, we know that Kraken basically provides information to Lupo. Lupo provides information to Kraken. They have that kind of Batman, Jim Gordon relationship going on, but they don't divulge everything. And they still do kind of keep things from each other to a degree. All this really comes to a head when Kraken looks over all the information, both from the entire massacre that happened out at the racetrack, as well as the whole thing that happened in the diner. Putting 2 and 2 together, he realizes whoever it was that did this, did it with surgical precision. They knew what they were doing. They were an exceedingly capable assassin. And so it's kind of on the trail of it basically being number 5. Lupo kind of hints at the idea that he knows it's number 5 or believes it's number 5, but Kraken, of course, figures it out right off the bat that he essentially knows that it's him. But ultimately, neither one really comes clean with their findings. And so as a result of that, you really just kind of have Kraken going about, kind of clearing his head, traveling back to the house. And you don't really get a whole lot going on here. It's really more of him just kind of chastising what is in effect Luther for just being overweight and having depression and stuff like that. Literally, he yells at him for having it, right? But at the end of the day, of course, it's just kind of designed to show the essential breakdown of the family dynamics of the Umbrella Academy, that even working together to save the world, there was seemingly no real way to unify them together. And so what you end up doing, of course, with number 5, basically, MIA, that Rumor's the one that figures out where he is by just a little artifact that he left in his room back at the house. And so by tracing it down, she basically finds number 5 in probably one of the weirdest moments in all of comics where number 5 is paying a chimp dressed as Marilyn Monroe singing "Happy Birthday to You, Mr. President" in a hotel room. So, hey, in New York City, you can get anything you want if you have enough money. If you have the money to pay for it, you can get it, right? That's basically what that is. And so again, a lot of stuff kind of happens in a really fast period of time. For example, you basically have Hazel and Cha-Cha that end up catching up to Seance. Of course, they knock him unconscious and then essentially kidnap him, all for the purpose of trying to find the information of where number 5 is, right? Just kind of going through each member of the family. Now, of course, as you guys may have known just from your time in reading Umbrella Academy, or even just from the show, that Seance just can't really use his powers when he has shoes on. Just one of those weird little caveats. And so he kind of makes the joke to have his shoes removed. Of course, they ultimately say no. But what ends up going on is that while you have Hazel and Cha-Cha that leave momentarily, the waitress takes off the shoes of Seance. And when that happens, he actually enters into a TV, tries to communicate with Luther, tell Luther he's being kidnapped. Luther's got to save him. And then, of course, Luther barely wakes up at the tail end of that, not really sure if it's a dream or not. The other part of this is that a deal had previously been worked out at the very beginning of the story back in the 1960s, back about 17 years later, where essentially in order for the Umbrella Academy to save Washington, D.C. from the statue of Abraham Lincoln that had gone awry, that a bargain was struck between Reginald Hargreaves and President Kennedy, that Kennedy would hand over nukes to Reginald Hargreaves. Those nukes never seem to have been used, but they're discovered by Hazel and Cha-Cha. And so what ends up going on is that Hazel and Cha-Cha actually bring the nukes in with the intention of essentially detonating them, right? With literally going, like, setting them off and basically destroying the world. Kind of this idea, if they can't find number 5, they'll just blow up the world and they'll call it a day, right? Just that's kind of the extent and the insanity to which these guys will go in order to achieve their goal. And so what you end up doing is switching over to this bit of an explanation that number 5 gives to Rumor, where Rumor literally tells him, "I want to know everything," and he effectively spills the beans. And what he says is that when he was stuck in the future and started transitioning back to the past, along the way, he'd basically been taken, right? He'd been caught by what is in effect Gerard Way's variation of the Time Variance Authority, right? Just an organization that exists out there. They're mostly referred to as the Temps Aeternalis. So basically an organization that exists in order to ensure the time stream isn't disrupted. People don't cause variations in the time stream and things progress as they're supposed to. One of the first things that happened is the body of number 5 was essentially modified to basically make him the best killer possible. And the way this was done was by quite literally taking personality traits to a degree, or capabilities, of every great assassin across the timeline and putting them inside him. And that's how he became so capable, is because he's basically the best assassin in existence, because he's every assassin in existence combined into one. And what he talks about is that there are a lot of people that are part of this organization that had been brought in from various circumstances, and they all basically serve the same role. When it comes to Hazel and Cha-Cha, that of course number 5 is better than them, but these guys are nuts. They're literally just crazy serial killer type characters. They'll just do whatever it is they need to do. I executed all kinds of missions for these guys, right? They call them corrections, but then eventually they assigned me a mission that I just wouldn't take, that they wanted me to take out Kennedy. And so ultimately he was like, that was the moral line that I simply couldn't cross because of the things he did and how he changed the country in such an effective way. So he ultimately went rogue, and he's basically been hunted by this time authority ever since. And so now that they know where he's at, that's why you have Hazel and Cha-Cha who were sent here. Now, of course, that's when you end up getting this whole scenario where you literally have Luther realizing the whole sequence with Seance was not a dream, and Seance was actually being kidnapped and he was going to be killed. He finally traces him down, gets to his location, but when he gets in there, he's ambushed by Hazel and Cha-Cha, who of course incapacitate him. And so what you end up getting is this really, really cool moment where you have a couple things that happen at the same time. And again, this is where the story gets kind of wild, if it hasn't really gotten wild already, that you basically have number 5, who again, communicating his whole story with Rumor. She doesn't believe him. She doesn't really believe anything it is that he's saying. And so that's when you have Carmichael, who shows up. Now, Carmichael is of course the fish in a fish tank attached to a body and running the entirety of this whole organization, or at least one of the people who's running the whole thing. And so when he appears, that's when Rumor realizes that's like all of this is basically true, right? Now the thing about that is this has to happen. The way that the Temps Aeternalis says, like, this has to take place. The assassination of Kennedy has to go down. It simply can't be ignored. One, it's a finite point in the time stream, and two, if that doesn't take place, it's going to cause all kinds of issues. And so the result of this is they're like, number 5 is rogue and he's out there. One, you have to stop him to ensure this takes place. And when the initial question is, why would we help you, right? Like, what reason do we have to do this? Like, we could just say no, right? Like, I mean, we could just blow it off. What they end up doing, or at least what Carmichael does, is he basically reveals that they have agents that are there with number 5's mom, and that they'll pull the trigger on its mom. And the bigger significance of this is that it's not just number 5 who will die, it's number 5's twin, right? He literally has a sibling out there that we haven't been introduced to yet, or at least seemingly haven't been introduced to yet. So literally, he's got another person out there. And so the result of that is, of course, with the two of them kind of being like, okay, number 5 has to exist. If he doesn't exist, essentially the world won't be saved. We'll all basically die because there'll be no one to warn us that the world is going to come to an end. Okay, like, we'll go on this mission because there are far bigger things at stake here than just the life of Kennedy, right? That's a pretty significant thing. And so what you end up doing here is switching over, back to Hazel and Cha-Cha, and you have them doing their whole thing, right? Kind of with the intention of just being like, we should let's just nuke it all, right? So what they end up doing is basically activating the nuclear bombs, right? The nuclear weapons. And then in turn, of course, they don't necessarily go off immediately. There's a kind of delayed effect with regards to these things. In the middle of this whole thing, one pulls a gun on the other, blows their head off, and then kills himself. And that's when you find out that what had happened is that with his shoes being removed, Seance had the ability to possess one of them and basically get them both killed. And so following that, what you have is them kind of asking the question, like, what in the world comes next, right? Like, what do we do here? Like, what do we do, like, quite literally, in this whole situation? And they effectively do the only thing they can do, that the missions kind of go off at the same time, that in this, time variance authority-esque place, right, the Aeternalis headquarters, that you have the mission that's essentially described by Carmichael in saying that number 5 will try to prevent the assassination of Kennedy, and he'll be in the book depository building, which is basically where, Lee Harvey Oswald was, and, at least depending on who you talk to, was the one who actually took out Kennedy. Some say he was never acting alone. That's probably one of the biggest things out there, right? One of the biggest discussions out there. It really just kind of goes both ways. But that's where number 5 in his old age will be. The job of younger number 5 and Rumor and the rest of these guys is to get out there and stop number 5 and ensure the whole thing goes through, right? To literally ensure that Kennedy is basically taken out. And that's when younger number 5 is like, okay, we can do that, but I have a plan, right? Literally, you always need a backup plan. I need your best surgeons. And so what you end up doing is jumping directly to Luther, along with Kraken, as well as Seance. And what Seance really does is, by going through and digging up the body of Pogo, he comes to the realization that Pogo's not there, right? Pogo's body isn't there, that he was basically buried somewhere else. In this body instead is basically the body of one of the time-traveling agents who they can use in order to go back in time and effectively ensure that presumably Kennedy's not taken out, right? Them being a part of that mission as well. And so that's where things kind of go nuts, because it's just all these different places, all these different locations or roles that lead to the same place. The funny thing about it is that where Luther asks about like the detonator and the nuclear weapons, the response to Seance is, no, we're good, man. Like, I got it all taken care of, right? These guys teleport away, the Earth explodes. The Earth is destroyed because Seance basically screwed up, right? None of it went down the way it was supposed to. And so what you end up doing here is jumping to all these different routes, meeting at the same place, right? All these people meeting at the same location in the sense of the whole thing in Dallas with Kennedy. Now, you do have number 5, at least old number 5 and young number 5, along with the forces of the Temp Aeternalis, who were all just shooting out, right, in the book depository building. It's just a great big huge shootout here. At the same time, you of course have the arrival of Kraken and Seance and Luther, who show up here, and they're able to just incapacitate these various agents actually on the side of older number 5, so they kind of intervene in this capacity. And that while you have everything taking place, the one question of Luther is, where's Rumor? And where number 5's like, I can't tell you where she is, right? It's just a really, really long story. Luther freaks out and literally goes to attack young number 5 and almost kills him, right? It's like, I'm gonna destroy you where you are unless you tell me what I need to know. And that's when younger number 5 is like, basically, there had to be a backup plan. And in fact, they kind of work, or at least older number 5 is told, go through and do your thing. Now, he doesn't actually take out Kennedy. Instead, he takes out the person that was going to take out Kennedy. Instead, what goes on here is in order to ensure that the death of Kennedy does take place, but it's not number 5, the older number 5, who's the one that has to do it, right, in order to have this blood on his hands. So essentially, he can maintain his moral role, but at the same time, allow the time stream to stay intact, that Rumor was down in the car with Kennedy posing as Jackie. And remember, because she can alter reality by using her voice, she tells Kennedy, I heard a rumor that the back of your head is about to explode. And that's how Kennedy dies. It looks like an assassination. Now, the way this plays out is that it's a really funny way that Gerard Way does this, because one of the big reasons that a lot of people say that Harvey Oswald wasn't acting alone is because people say that there was another shooter, that when you had the impact of the bullets, that there had to be somebody on quote unquote the grassy knoll. This basically satisfies that. It satisfies the assassination of Kennedy or the death of Kennedy and the fact that somebody else had to be acting or had to be involved there because the direction of the bullets and the impact and all that kind of stuff just doesn't match up. So in a lot of ways, this kind of Gerard Way just sort of playing on that idea that, again, Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't acting alone. But with everything sort of sorted out, right? Everything basically kind of arranged and taken care of, that with everybody focusing on the president once he's rushed to the hospital, but of course presumed dead, what it does is it allows Rumor, again, posing as Jackie Kennedy, to sort of move away for a minute because the real Jackie Kennedy is actually there. And a lot of people, the initial diagnosis of the doctor is, well, obviously she's in shock. That's why she can't remember everything. Once the shock wears off and she comes to, she'll recall the entire event, but it's her mind trying to deal with a very traumatic experience. The truth about it is that Jackie Kennedy wasn't there, right? It was Rumor posing as Jackie Kennedy. By this point, Rumor's basically posed as a nurse and then just kind of goes into what is basically an ambulance occupied by the rest of the team, and then of course manages to get away with them all. But the crazy thing about this is that when the question's asked, like, was it worth it, and is this really what you did to get your voice back, Rumor takes it as a personal affront, because while she did go with the Temps Aeternalis in order to get her voice back so she could operate as part of this whole campaign, right, this whole scheme, the reality here is she didn't do it of her own volition. She didn't do it because she just really wanted her voice back that bad. That's what Luther's assumption is. She did it because the reality here is that Luther is the twin of number 5. He's basically his biological brother. And that if the mother of number 5 had been killed the way that Carmichael said she would, that what it would do is it would essentially lead to the deaths of both Luther and number 5. She did this to save the life of Luther. But at the end of the day, Luther, I wouldn't go as far as to say didn't want to hear it, but it does kind of take him by surprise. And it does sort of shock him that that's sort of the bigger picture going on here. Now, of course, once they arrive back in the modern day, what they were expecting was just some kind of huge change, right? The whole idea of corrections, the time stream, maybe it would be some kind of modern utopia or something like that. When they get back, it's all basically the same. There's no real difference here. And so while we would expect the world to have been destroyed, right? Them arriving back to a dead world, what you end up having is the arrival of Carmichael. And Carmichael basically spills the beans and explains everything that's going on. And what Carmichael says here is that when it comes to the corrections, it's not somehow fixing a timeline, or it's not as though, Kennedy having gone out the way that he did would somehow make everything better. That the reality here is the timeline has to exist in its current form, right? Kennedy had to be taken out when he did. Things had to progress from there. It had to go that way. And so the result of this is them just basically ensuring things work out. That the reality is that the end of Kennedy was supposed to happen at the hands of number 5. And that because number 5 initially chose not to, other arrangements had to be made. But the point behind this is that with the rest of the team getting involved, them going back in time, all that kind of stuff, that it allowed the timeline to happen the way that it was supposed to. The arrival of like Hazel and Cha-Cha, right? Like the nukes going off, all that kind of stuff. That was all a result of the fact that number 5 initially refused to take out Kennedy, right? A cascading effect. That because of one decision that was made, that it essentially created a branch timeline that they didn't know they were a part of, that resulted in Kennedy essentially surviving, right? Continuing on and living. That because Kennedy was taken out, those nukes never got in the hands of Reginald Hargreaves, which never got to the hands of Hazel and Cha-Cha, which never ended the world. That kind of a thing, right? So everything else basically remains intact, but the world has just essentially inadvertently been saved, or at least was saved by the Umbrella Academy, who didn't know that they were essentially being used by Carmichael and all those different guys. And so realizing that kind of manipulation was going on behind the scenes, number 5, the younger number 5, freaks, destroys the glass jar housing Carmichael, and then eats him. just as a sheer display of anger, right? Literally just destroys that guy, just consumes that guy. And so following that, again, the team basically disbands. They're really just a defunct, like just a totally divided family in a variety of different ways. They just kind of go their own way and do their own thing. That you do have Rumor, who goes back to White Violin, basically kind of makes amends, or the two of them reconcile to a degree. Seance listens to a song on a jukebox at a bar, just things like that, right? Kraken goes and does his own thing, just their own kind of breakaway, their own kind of deviation, just doing their own thing and having nothing to do with anything else. So with that being said, guys, again, when it comes to Umbrella Academy, these stories are really, really wild. And it's the reason why the Netflix series toned it all down so much, because, I mean, we're doing the finer points here. There are, the broad points. There are some finer points that go on, but truth to tell, the comics can be really tough to follow it sometimes. So I wouldn't be surprised if you were just kind of like, I mean, this video is kind of tough to follow. Yeah, because the comics are kind of hard to follow. Things jump back and forth. It's done really, really janky. The artwork is a little rough, so it can be kind of hard to follow as well. They're not bad. They're really entertaining and they're really fun. It's just the chronology can be a little difficult to follow. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.